Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to open this special Zoom event in honor of Professor Carol Gilligan and her new book, In a Human Voice. I am Professor Triger of the Haim Faculty of Law at the College of Management. Published in September 2023, In a Human Voice re-examines the central arguments of Carol Gilligan's landmark book, In a Different Voice, which was published 40 years ago. In a Human Voice is currently being translated into Hebrew and will be published next year in the prestigious Red Line imprint of Hakibbutz HaMeuchad, who also published Professor Gilligan's Joining the Resistance, להצטרף להתנגדות, back in 2016. And I am grateful to the Haim Faculty of Law and to the Emile Zola Chair for Human Rights for their generous support, which allowed to hold this event this evening and to produce the forthcoming Hebrew edition of the book. So we have a fascinating meeting ahead of us. We are honored again to have with us tonight Professor Carol Gilligan of New York University joining us live from the US. Our commentators are Professor Frances Raday, Professor Emerita at the Haim Faculty of Law, Dr. Ruthy Lowenstein Lazar, Dean of the Faculty of Law, and Dr. Rawia Aburabia of the Sapir College School of Law. I would like to begin with a short conversation with Professor Gilligan on the new book, on In a Different Voice, and on other matters. So good afternoon, Professor Gilligan. Great to have you with us here.
Professor Triger.
What is the book In a Human Voice about, and why did you write it now?
I wrote the book for two reasons. I mean, one is very simple, because it was 40 years, and it was an anniversary to go back and revisit. And I think because obviously the title echoes my 40 years ago book, that often people don't say, what did I do during these 40 years? Because, it's not as though I was asleep and I woke up 40 years later and I thought, oh my God, I have to change the title of my book. I had been deeply involved in research. In fact, I spent 10 years listening to girls, which in some ways sounds marginal, turned out to be central, because up until that time, the questions about women and women's psychology or listening to women, which is what led me to write In a Different Voice. Usually it's saying women compared to men. And what I noticed after I'd written In a Different Voice is that, in fact, in psychology, no one had studied girls. That the psychology, and particularly the psychology of children growing up, was based on studies of boys. And so I thought I would do the most straightforward piece of research. I would fill in a missing stretch of, psychological development. And with my graduate students, I spent 10 years listening to girls that then led to two of my former students. When I did it with one of them, Judy Chu, and then Niobe Wei, doing new studies of boys. And that in conjunction with new research in neuroscience and in anthropology and studies of infants completely changed the story, the account, the understanding of who we are as humans and how we develop. So 40 years after In a Different Voice, it was the anniversary. That's always, an occasion to, but because of that work, or through that work, including my own work, I had come to a kind of clarity, which was really, in a sense, amazing to me, because what I came to see was so obvious. And the question in some ways became, how did it take me 40 years to see something that seemed so clear? So I can say it very concisely. And my book, In a Human Voice, is a short book. And even my sentences have gotten shorter as a writer. So here's the core of this new book. The different voice. In other words, what I heard as a different way of speaking about moral conflicts and thinking about morality and moral decision-making and thinking about the self, speaking about identity or the self. What I had heard as a different way of speaking that I called the voice of care ethics, but that I and others heard at the time, 40 years ago, as a quote, feminine voice, is in fact a human voice. And that calling it a feminine voice is a problem. But the different voice is a human voice, the voice of care ethics, that the voice it differs from is a patriarchal voice, meaning a voice that splits human capacities into either masculine or feminine. So where caring is seen as feminine. And that where patriarchy is in force or enforced, the human voice is a voice of resistance, and care ethics is an ethics of liberation. And that was so concise, those three statements. The different voice is a human voice, the voice it differs from is a patriarchal voice. In patriarchy, the human voice is a voice of resistance, meaning to a structure of domination. And therefore, care ethics is an ethics of liberation. And it seemed to me, first of all, very obvious with a lot of human science evidence behind it, and also very hopeful, because it says the seeds of transformation, the seeds of the solution to some of the more devastating problems we're facing is within ourselves. So that was the occasion. It was that really thought, this is the moment for me to change my title and say what I couldn't be said or seen, and to ask what kept us from seeing this. It was like asking us, what is blinding us to aspects of ourselves and our experience that really in some ways is obvious once you see it.
Thank you very much for that. You begin in A Human Voice with a very interesting history of the publication of The Different Voice, the article that preceded the book. Would you like to read that story from the new book?
First of all, I would love to read it, and I would also like to say, maybe after I read it, just to tell you that the Harvard Ed Review, which like the law review, it's student run, that to honor the 45th anniversary of the publication of that article called In a Different Voice, Women's Conceptions of Self and of Morality, they published a symposium on it. They reprinted the article now, and they talk about this story. So let me read the story and then we could talk about it. This is from the introduction to In a Human Voice. The initial paper, which I wrote in the winter of 1975, this was the paper In a Different Voice, Women's Conceptions of Self and of Morality. And it was based on the study I had done right in the aftermath, since this is a law school, of the US Supreme Court decision in Roe v. Wade in 1973 that said to American women, you have a legitimate voice in making the decision of whether to continue or to end a pregnancy under certain specifications. Meaning saying to women, you have a moral voice and you have the legitimacy to make this decision, which completely challenged a tradition that said to a woman that to be a good woman meant to be selfless, meaning to respond to other people's needs and concerns, but not to, in a sense, speak from your own position. So this was a huge thing. And at that moment, I interviewed a range of women. This was in and around Boston. I was at Harvard at the time. White women, Black women, working classes, who were actually pregnant and making the decision. And listening to them, I heard a way of speaking about this decision that was at odds with the public abortion debate then and now, and also with theories of moral and identity development that I had been teaching. So I wrote a paper called In a Different Voice. Specifically, here's a different way of speaking about morality. And it became a citation classic, meaning the most cited paper of that year. So here's the story. It's when I wrote it, I circulated it among my students who sent it to friends, who sent it to friends. And it was a time of purple mimeograph machines. Probably very few people here remember this, but I do. And the essay circulated like samizdat, which fit with my sense of myself at the time as a member of some sort of underground. Then one day, one of these students, who was on the editorial board of the Harvard Educational Review, asked if he could submit the paper to the journal. And without thinking much about it, I said, okay. I don't remember how long they kept it, only that it came back saying rejected. Just that, no request to revise and resubmit, just rejected, along with the comment, we don't know what this is. And that got my back up. You don't know what this is? I will add headings, which I did and sent it back to them. This time, when the paper came back, they said, this is not social science. They said, if I would rewrite the paper in an impersonal voice and from an objective standpoint, they would consider it. I said, it's called in a different voice. And for whatever reason, I suspect that because by that time they were tired of dealing with me, or perhaps it was my insistence on being heard, they decided to publish the paper and be done with it. That the essay went on to become a citation classic, the best-selling reprint of the Harvard Educational Review, and the centerpiece of my 1982 book, makes this a good story to tell to graduate students who are tempted to withdraw in the face of rejection, or who cannot imagine that In a Different Voice could have had such an inauspicious beginning. But telling this story recently on 2 occasions when I was asked to speak about my book, I came to see that at the very outset, In a Different Voice was recognized for what it was, a disruption. We don't know what this is.
Thank you very much. And speaking of not knowing what this is and a disruption, you co-wrote a new paper with Naomi Snyder and Yael Khalak, in which you analyzed interviews with middle school girls from New York and Boston and compared them to interviews with Israeli spotters, tatzpitaniot, and the similarities are striking. Could you please say a little more about this new article?
Well, yes, we presented this paper just 2 or 3 weeks ago. And what happened was Yael Khalek came to a talk I gave in New York about In a Human Voice. And she asked afterward, could she interview me for Haaretz? And I think some of you saw the interview. And in the course of that, then she said to me she was interested in my research, and she told me that she had interviewed the 18 to 20-year-old girls who were the spotters who were stationed on the border with Gaza. Well, first of all, I was fascinated. I was interviewing middle school and high school girls in the US. And so Naomi and I were going to write this paper called Dissociation, Dissociation, Double Consciousness, and Doublethink, where Freud meets W.E.B. Du Bois and George Orwell. And we were going to focus it on the pilot study of our interviews with these girls. And I thought, wow, to bring the voices of the spotters in would be very interesting. What I didn't know until we brought them together was the extraordinary, I mean, literally word by word parallels. So the parallels were this, that first, the tendency for relationships among girls to be called drama. And that word is used by the Hebrew speakers too. They call about drama, or the phrase drama queen. In other words, to dismiss what's going on among girls as a kind of performance or a show, as somehow not real or not. But then that the idea that followed it, the high school girls in our study from Boston and New York began to talk about what they called, and the quote was, a battle not worth fighting. meaning the battle for relationship. That in fact, of speaking and find that they were met with either they weren't listened to, or they weren't heard, or they were told that they were not being sensitive to other people's feelings, or that they were making trouble. In other words, that they shouldn't be saying what they knew on the basis of their experience, and that the battle, like, for example, one girl in our studies talked about holding myself back for the sake of maintaining deeper connections. And I was the interviewer. I hold myself back so as not to jeopardize deeper connections. I said to her, can I ask you the obvious question? Because what are these connections that she is maintaining by silencing herself? And she could see it. So the sense that the fight for a relationship was not worth fighting for because, and that's exact same phrase was used by the spotters, that when they tried to speak about what they were seeing, because they would spend 8 hours, you know this more than I do, 8 hours a day, stationed on the border with Gaza. They were 18 to 20-year-old non-combat IDF soldiers. They were told by their superiors in the army, you are the eyes, we are the brains. In other words, what they saw, and they saw the preparations for the October 7th. They saw that something was being prepared and that this was coming. They even, had a sense of was not listened to. So to put these two things together, otherwise when girls say nobody listens to me, people think, oh, girls, they always whatever. Suddenly you think the costs of not listening suddenly became very real, and the whole question took on a completely different dimension. And so bringing Yael's work into relationship with the studies of the girls was, it was an extraordinary, just in terms of realizing what's at stake, this dismissal of the voices of basically large parts of the population.
Thank you very much for that. We see the devastating cost of denying the human voice and not listening to the human voice in our everyday life, always and especially since October 7th. Thank you very much, Carol. We will now turn to our exquisite panel of speakers. First, Professor Frances Raday. Professor Raday is a professor emerita at the Haim School of Law at the College of Management, where she also acts as president of the Concord Center for Integration of International Law in Israel. She's also an honorary professor at University College of London and is doctor honoris at the University of Copenhagen. She has been and continues to be an activist for human rights. She was a litigator in Israel's Supreme Court, an expert member of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women Committee, and a member of various governmental and non-governmental organizations. Professor Raday served as a member of the UN Human Rights Council Working Group on Discrimination Against Women. Professor Raday's research has focused on the development of theory as regards to rights, to equality of disadvantaged groups. She has written and edited a number of books and many academic articles on these issues. Professor Raday, the floor is yours.
She's muted.
Please unmute yourself, Frances. Frances, you're on mute.
I said thank you very much. The list gets long because I've been at it a very long time. So, so thank you for going back over my history. It's always such a great pleasure and privilege to read and to hear Carol Gilligan. But it's especially moving to connect with her deep humanism in the treacherous times for humanism in which we are living. So welcome, Carol, and thank you for these precious moments of reflection and encouragement and intellectual stimulation. In A Human Voice, I will talk about it as Carol Gilligan and not say you all the time. In A Human Voice, Carol Gilligan revisits her brilliant psychological study of the ethic of care as feminine and her critique of the devaluation of that ethic by society. In this book, she clarifies and merges these two elements, in my opinion. I'm not prepared to give up a different voice. I see these as cumulative works, great works. And so she merges these two elements, the female expression of care and its social undervaluation. And she then designates, and thus in the new book, In A Human Voice, she designates the care ethic as a human concern. I look at two distinct ways of addressing the policy implications of moving the ethic of care from the discourse on difference in voices of women and men to the merging of these voices into a unified human voice. The first is in the promotion of the ethic of care as a universal value and commitment, no longer in a pink ghetto. The second is in transformation of the care ethic from a female concern to one which is a human concern, thus bringing the analysis into the realm of the rejection of a gender binary. So I want to look at both those aspects. So first then, the move to promote care as a universal value and commitment. Carol Gilligan is in fact clarifying and articulating what was implicit in her original theme in a different voice in exposing the undervaluing of the care ethic as female. She was in corollary designating the necessity of valuing the care ethic as universal. So the seeds of the human voice were well planted in a different voice. Carol Gilligan's research, based on psychology, designated the care ethic as care for others and response to their needs and concerns. I want to focus on the relevance of this care ethic in the context of universal human rights. The Universal Human Rights Project has transformed the very concept of others and the response to their needs and concerns. This transformation encompasses perennial societal others as well as intimate others. Gilligan's ethic of care as a response to the needs and concerns of others readily translates into international human rights concepts. It is entrenched in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Bill of Rights in the recognition of every other, irrespective of their birth or social status, race, sex, or religion, as an equal repository of human rights. This, the non-distinction principle, purports nothing less than the requirement of normative empathy for all others and recognition of their entitlement to equal concern in all social institutions. This ethic of care is further elaborated in the Economic and Social Rights Convention, in CEDAW, the Women's Convention, the Children's Convention, Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the ILO Conventions for Workers and Migrants, and in the Sustainable Development Agenda. However, the universal human right to care, though recognized in international human rights law in the way that I have said, is not only far from implementation, but also subject to erosion. The erosion stems from two ideological challenges, those of the neoliberal economic hegemony and those of the conservative religious lobby. And for this reason, the book In a Human Voice is so pertinent, so important, and must be made part of the human rights discourse. The neoliberal hegemony has eroded the care ethic in developing extremes of economic inequality and reduction of social benefits and services, and in responding to financial crises with regimes of austerity. The conservative religious lobby has affected the most recent egregious erosion of the ethic of care in the backsliding on women's right to abortion. And this is in both the United States and the United Nations. As Carol discusses, the Dobbs decision in the United States Supreme Court reversed Roe versus Wade, women's constitutional right to abortion at will during the first trimester of a pregnancy. In 2016, as chair of the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women, I had actually cited Roe versus Wade as good practice, as good state practice in a blueprint on women's reproductive rights, which was published at the international level as a WGDOR, as a Working Group on Discrimination Against Women position paper in the Human Rights Council Special Procedures. However, at the international level, the guarantee of the right to abortion, which we had propounded in our 2016 paper as being in accordance with the state of international law and opinion, was being eroded, with a conservative general comment of the Human Rights Committee, the treaty body which sits on the Civil and Political Rights Convention, and gave a general comment on the right to life in 2018, reversing this more liberal approach and caring approach to women's reproductive rights and right to abortion. And it culminated more recently in the Security Council in 2019, reneging on its previous resolution, calling on states to provide abortion at will to women and girls raped in conflict. We all know that women and girls raped in conflict, and you were talking about the Tatspitaniot, and our current situation with the women hostages is one of the most tragic situations in which women may find themselves. And not only the women, but also if pregnancies continue, the children of such pregnancies are known to be subject to horrific social stigma. But in 2019, the Security Council refused to call on states to provide abortion to women raped in conflict. They said they and their babies should have support, thus leaving women to cope with pregnancies which endanger their life, health, or social and economic survival, and in this abandoning the ethic of care for an ethic of uncare. Hence, Carol Gilligan's call for valuing the human ethic of care is a vital contribution to the effort to sustain and revive the viability of the universal human right to care and obligation of states to provide to secure care. The second aspect of this fine, fine book is a shift from women's voice to a human voice, analyzing the care ethic in the context of the current discourse of rejection of a gender binary. Here, Carol Gilligan provides empirical evidence that care is not essentially or exclusively a woman's concern, although concerns about care and caring were articulated more often by women than men in her research. She also reiterates, as indeed was implicit in her original work, that the difference is probably the result of gender socialization. The transformation of care from a feminized to a shared female and male obligation is not only a part of academic discourse, is also a requirement of international human rights law, as for instance under the CEDAW Convention, which mandates the common responsibility of men and women in the upbringing of children. However, in practice, the provision of care continues to be a feminized function, with women carrying out a disparate proportion of the care for children, the elderly, and the disabled, as either unpaid or very low paid care work. In my recent book, Economic Woman, I bring data from the World Economic Forum and from the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which shows that globally, men do only 37% of the unpaid work that women do. This care gap persists in high-income as well as low-income countries. It holds whether women work in the cash economy or not. Additionally, paid care work is grossly underpaid and is also performed by, guess who? Almost exclusively women. Furthermore, in socialist countries such as Russia, China, and Israel, where childcare used to be a social protection floor subsidized by the state, is being privatized in the global adoption of neoliberal economic policies. And this has resulted in the reimposition of the burden of care on the family and within the family on women. In our 2014 report to the Human Rights Council, we called for a social protection floor from all states, that all states should provide a social protection floor for the provision of care services, not only for children, but also for the elderly, the sick, and the disabled. The proposal was partially adopted by the Human Rights Council in 2014. Nevertheless, we're back to the same problem. Despite declaratory international acceptance of the requirement of common care responsibilities for men and women, there are influential political moves which seek to reinforce the gender division of care responsibilities in the family. The accession to the power of alt-right political leadership signifies a new legitimization of xenophobia, misogyny, and traditional religious values. In the Human Rights Council, there is an ongoing campaign by the states which constitute a traditionalist religious lobby to deny the universality of the human rights agenda and pass resolutions calling for reinterpretation of human rights in accordance with traditional values, and also resolutions calling for protection of the family, while refusing to include, in spite of being directly asked to do so by myself and other experts, refusing to include in such resolutions on protection of the family the right of women to equality in the family, which is, of course, closely connected with the equitable division of care functions between men and women. These lobbies are led by the Organization of Islamic Communities, Muslim countries, Russia, and the Vatican, and have succeeded in garnering the support of the majority of states in the Council over the past 15 years. To me, it was a shock to find that the majority of states in the Council went along with these resolutions. These resolutions have been consistently opposed by the WEOG states, that's Western Europe and other countries, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the core of democratic states in the world. The human rights experts in the treaty bodies have consistently opposed these resolutions and the special procedures of the Human Rights Council. Global NGOs also, all of them assert the universality of human rights, their priority over traditional values, and the right of women to equality in the family. In this context of declaratory equality, the declaration at the international human rights level of equality between women and men in care functions, accompanied by the ongoing gender division of care in practice, and the traditionalist backlash against women's right to equality in the family, the question is whether the abandonment of the gender binary serves to eliminate the gender care gap, or whether it obscures it, whitewashing the pink ghetto and making it more difficult to challenge it as a matter of discrimination against women. In order to avoid obscuring the ongoing care deficit, care deficit as an issue primarily in practice affecting and discriminating against women, it's essential, while promoting a universal ethic of care, to remember that it also remains a women's issue. Abandoning the gender binary in favor of universality can serve the purpose of mainstreaming the care ethic. This leads to a recognition that the provision of care services is essential for social justice and sustainable development, that it must be shared by women and men, that it must be supported and subsidized by social institutions, and that it must be incorporated in the macroeconomic policy of the state. At the same time, the female specificity of caring means that this implementation of the care ethic is crucial for elimination of discrimination against women, and is crucial for securing women's equal opportunity in social and economic life. Like the wave-particle duality of light, I conclude, it is in the accumulation of a different voice and a human voice that Carol Gilligan provides us with a roadmap to navigate duality of care as being both human and gendered. The human voice of care does not eliminate women's voice of care. While on one hand, the human voice mainstreams the care ethic, on the other hand, the different voice allows recognition of its persistent female specificity. So I haven't given up on a different voice, Carol. I insist that it takes its place alongside a human voice.
Thank you so much, Frances, for this thought-provoking and illuminating talk. Carol, would you like to respond, or maybe at the end?
Just to say, thank you. Just brilliant talk, and thank you so much. I mean, and I completely agree with you. I don't give up on In a Different Voice. In fact, what I think is the points are they're in a different voice, and my frustration was to see my work kind of, it was as though you couldn't see that because of this gendering of it as feminine. I also agree with you, which is, it's why I'm about my point about the girls, that to obscure what women know as a result of doing the lion's share, women and often women of color, of doing the lion's share of care work. So to not, in a sense, invite those voices to inform the discussion about care would be a huge mistake. So I deeply appreciate what you said, and I've learned from listening to you, and thank you. And I did not mean In a Human Voice in any way to supersede In a Different Voice, but really to join it and to raise, to in a sense, raise the question of what kept us from seeing that this is a human voice, this care voice, and the costs. And I would say to men, to women, to society of gendering, caring as feminine. I mean, the loss that comes there. Anyway, I thought it was just, thank you so much. I mean, it was a brilliant.
Thank you so much. and I think I'm responding partly to the reviews of the human voice, which don't always maintain the duality. As I said in my talk, I think you do.
I do. Yes, no, I definitely do. But thank you. It's so deeply, I mean, when you were talking about human rights, it's so moving to be heard and to be read accurately. And so I'm deeply moved, Frances, and very appreciative.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Ruthy Lowenstein Lazar. Dr. Lowenstein Lazar is the Dean of the Law Faculty at the College of Management. For the past decade, she has served as the Director of the Legal Clinical Center and the Women's Rights Clinic at the Law Faculty. She has been deeply engaged in feminist activism, which earned her the Ot Katan Prize, awarded to women academics who advance gender equality and activism. Her research primarily focuses on gender and criminal law, violence against women, sexual violence, and victims' rights. Below is a short selection of her scholarly work. Me Too, The Invisible Older Victims of Sexual Violence. Another article is The Epistemic Twilight Zone of Consent. Gender and Corporate Crime, Do Women on the Board of Directors Reduce Corporate Bad Behavior? And Toward a Social Legal Theory of Male Rape. Dr. Lowenstein, Lazar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tzvika, and thank you for organizing it. Tzvika and I spoke, I think, in the last year here in the walls of the faculty, and our dream came true today. So Tzvika, thank you. And Carol, thank you for this inspiring and thought-provoking book. I have to admit, before formally starting my talk, that I read this book and I had many identities kind of throughout the readings. I read it as a woman, of course, and as a feminist scholar and a feminist teacher. I saw some of my students here in the black here on the computer. And I also read it as a dean, a woman dean, with all the loneliness that is part of this job. And also as a mother of two young men and a very young girl. So all these identities were running through my head while reading the book. So thank you. And I will begin by discussing some of Professor Gilligan's ideas, and then I will relate it to my research on sexual violence and against men and sexual consent of men. I have to admit that my primary intention was to relate it to my main focus on my research, which is sexual consent of women. And it just took me to these projects of sexual violence against men. And I think this inclusive voice that you present in this book is very relevant to these subjects. So Professor Gilligan's book is about the human and not the woman. It is about a human voice, about a human self, human perspective, human behavior, and it seeks to degender this different voice that we all thought of as feminine. And I quote Professor Gilligan, this different voice that's gendered feminine, it's a human voice. And Carol, your extensive research with children demonstrates how both boys and girls are socially and culturally compelled to suppress their authentic voices. And they are pressured to conceal, to disregard, to remain silent. Silence is a huge motive in this book about their needs, about their preferences, their perceptions, their feelings, emotions, and even their choice of music, as illustrated in one of the stories that Carl, you give in the book, a boy who chose kind of a girl music, and all the boys look at him and he felt ridiculous and ashamed, and then he picked kind of a more male song. So both boys and girls are conditioned to conform to social gendered codes. How? So boys are taught to prioritize reason over emotion, to focus on the self over others, to be active rather than passive, to be strong physically and emotionally, hide their emotions. Boys will always be boys, right? And this has various implications for men who are victims of sexual violence and are in a position of vulnerability and weakness, and I will go back to it shortly in my talk. Conversely, girls are encouraged to express their emotions, to be emotional. They are encouraged to define themselves in relation to others. And you state that by dichotomizing reason, which is associated with masculinity, from emotion, which is feminine, the mind, masculine, from the body, feminine, the self, again, masculine, from the relationship, these binaries undermine our capacity, everybody's capacity, to comprehend our emotions, to be attentive to others, to be attentive to ourselves, to our own thoughts and needs, to maintain connections with others, and effectively to navigate the social world. And this division not only sets the stage, but also legitimizes the hierarchy that privileges the masculine over the feminine. And consequently, the feminine, girls, young women, old women, and also, which is again relates to my research, or part of my research, people who are perceived as feminine, this feminine idea, this feminine model, this feminine person is marginalized from the realm of human experience. And this is patriarchy. And I will take this definition in my classes on gender and on sexual violence. This is patriarchy. This is how power relations are preserved and maintained. And I took one of Gilligan's quotes. I wanted to take just quote the book here. But you state, patriarchy is an order of living based on a gender binary and hierarchy. To be a man, one must be masculine, not feminine, and also superior, both to men who are not perceived as real men and to women. In patriarchy, the order is him over her, straight over gay. So this is the point of intersection at which I turn to my research on sexual violence against men and male sexual consent with Professor Orna Eliagon. She's supposed to be here somewhere. And on sexual consent of gay men, which I conducted with Dr. Noina Aman, who also should be here. And I will try to reflect on my research employing Professor Gilligan's ideas. So vast scholarship theorizes and analyzes situations where women are raped, are compelled to engage in sex. Similar discussion hardly occurs with respect to male victims. The absence of discourse of consent where male are victims of sexual violence is actually astonishing, given the extensive feminist theories and writings and debates and books on consent. And when Orna, my great partner for this project on male rape, and we were amazed when we started this project by this missing theme in the discourse of male rape, how it is possible and why. And I think that some of the ideas here in the book may offer some explanation. So the concept of consent is a heteronormative, or at least was evolved and was shaped and designed within heterosexual relationships. It is associated, many would say also express power relations between men and women. It is the social role of men to initiate. Again, it is not the social role, but it is what we expect men to initiate. And women's limited role is grant or withhold consent. So consent is a concept that does not express mutual desire. It does not express willingness, communication, language. Again, central motives in this book and in all your writing, but rather it is an asymmetric power gap between active masculinity and passive femininity. And conceptualizing male consent, therefore, challenges this heteronormative script. It challenges these social code, these cultural roles in sexual interactions. And in the book, you discuss the socialization of children or the indoctrination of children to being active, boys, or passive girls, to speaking out, again, boys, or speaking for someone, girls, saying what they want or saying what they are expected to say. And you call it, I really think. You ask someone, but what do you really think, right? The girls. So in the process of socialization and acceptance into the grown-up world, which is patriarchal, which is gendered, and now I quote, children will divorce, and this is just a very strong paragraph, children will divorce their sense of themselves from those aspects of themselves that might lead their masculinity or their femininity to be called into question. So they are forced, children, and later on it's us, right? They are forced to disconnect from themselves in order to have relationships. They must learn to conceal parts of themselves in order to be included, in order to be part of. So girls, they conceal their authentic voice because it sounds, and I will quote again, stupid or rude or crazy, and I add aggressive and male, masculine, and boys' voice of emotions and their vulnerable parts in their voice is heard, and again, I quote, babyish or girly or gay. So this, of course, relates and affects and shapes the construction of sexuality and sexual relations and behavior. Men are expected to act, again, as the initiator of sex, active participant in a state of constant desire, and their consent in heterosexual relationship is therefore taken for granted. And also, according to the social paradigm of masculinity, men are expected to demonstrate physical strength, to control the situation, to therefore be able to defend themselves, to physically resist the sexual violence. So when they are raped or do not consent or do not want sex and are forced to engage in sex, it is seen as if they are failed to resist. And consequently, they are described as stripped of their masculinity. They are less of a real man. And the socialization of children into these scripts that support patriarchy creates this hierarchy of gender roles. So masculinity stand higher than femininity on the ladder of gender hierarchy, and then hegemonic masculinity rates higher than gay or minority masculinities. So these men, these victims, men who are victims of sexual violence, they go through a female experience, which is an inferior experience of being victims of sexual violence, being vulnerable, powerless, and weak compared to other men. And in such a framework, male victims may struggle to reconcile their experience with societal expectations. They're ashamed, they're self-blamed of their vulnerability and weakness. And this is complicated when the victims are gay men. So gay men are perceived as less masculine. They, like certain types of women, they are more prone to consent because of their sexual orientation, because of their, and again, in quotation mark, deviant sexuality. They are the opposite of the ideal victim. So research, another research that I'm conducting these days with Dr. Noina Aman on sexual consent of gay men in public gay spaces such as clubs and saunas, in which we conducted interviews and still conduct interviews with the gay men. This research offer kind of another layer of fascinating themes on consent, sexuality, and masculinity. And again, this had made me think of this research while I was reading the book. In the interviews that we conducted, one of the themes was the tension between agency and victimization, between pleasure and risk. And there is an ambivalence regarding the conceptualization of the experience of these interviewees. Was it rape? Was it sexual violence? Was it unwanted sex? The line of consent are blurred. And this is, of course, related to the voice that is diminished and deprived of men and women. For many within the gay community, the journey towards self-acceptance and self-identity and sexual liberation, towards connecting with themselves, towards reclaiming their voice, has been fraught with societal stigma and internalized shame. So in response, sexual liberation has long been celebrated as the cornerstone of identity and self-expression. However, questions of consent can become blurred, overshadowed by this desire for autonomy, to assert autonomy and oppose societal norms. And I will conclude by using one of the very strong phrases in this book. And Carol, you write, the construction of human capabilities as either masculine or feminine is not only a distortion of reality, but a cornerstone of patriarchy. Sexual violence, of course, against men and women is also a cornerstone of patriarchy. And I think an inclusive voice, a human voice that you offer in this book may further the recognition of sexual violence against men and may disrupt patriarchy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ruthy. It was fascinating. Carol, do you want to say a few words, or?
I want to agree with you. It was fascinating. Ruthy, thank you so much for this and for your reading, your strong reading of the book, which I really, really appreciate. And for taking the implications in terms of thinking, I mean, across the gender spectrum. I mean, it speaks as directly to men as it does to women. I mean, it's the consequences. I hadn't thought about it specifically in terms of sexual violence or the issue of consent, which of course is an issue of voice, and kind of where men feel that they cannot have a voice in order to maintain a kind of masculinity, which depends on their silencing aspects of their own human qualities, including, I mean, this very basic quality of one's vulnerability. And I thought that was just brilliant. And thank you so much for this reading. This is just extraordinary for me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker is Dr. Rawia Aburabia. Dr. Aburabia is a senior lecturer at Sapir Academic College School of Law. She earned her PhD from the Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in an interdisciplinary doctoral program titled Human Rights Under Pressure, Ethics, Law, and Politics, which is jointly held by the Hebrew University and the Freie Universität of Berlin. Dr. Aburabia received her LLM in International Human Rights Law from the American University at Washington College of Law, Washington, D.C. She teaches and researches in the fields of family law, international human rights law, feminist jurisprudence, and minority rights. Dr. Aburabia has received several awards for her academic and feminist work. She was awarded the Ma'of Scholarship of the Council of Higher Education for Outstanding Arab Scholars in 2020 and the Polonsky Postdoctoral Fellowship in 2019. She was selected by Globes magazine's 40 Under 40 Most Promising Young Leaders in Israel in 2018 and by 972 magazine's Person of the Year, Women Activists of the Arab World in 2011. Dr. Aburabia practiced as a human rights attorney for the Association for Civil Rights in Israel and has been at the forefront of several civil rights initiatives concerning the unrecognized Bedouin villages and Bedouin women's rights in Israel. So Dr. Aburabia, Rawia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Professor Triger, for the invitation to be part of this event and to celebrate Professor Carol Gilligan's wonderful book, In a Human Voice. I'm truly honored. Welcome, Professor Gilligan. I will focus my short talk on the current moment in paraphrasing Spivak's seminal work, Can the Subaltern Speak? We might ask, can the Palestinian subject speak? This inquiry resonates deeply with my personal experience as a Palestinian navigating the complex terrain where speaking out is both a necessity and a struggle, often silenced by internal and external mechanisms. Professor Gilligan's exploration of the human voice extends beyond the realm of gender, delving into the broader amplification of being truly heard amidst oppression. Gaza is both very close and very distant, denied and contested. The Israeli subconscious seeks to erase or replace it. It only reappears in the context of violence. Its denial is facilitated through the colonial vocabulary that doesn't see its inhabitants as human beings. The siege on Gaza is denied and obscured, and now even the genocidal violence is pushed back and denied in Israeli public opinion. During times of war, this colonial gaze becomes even sharper. Despite Gaza's systematic disappearance from the media, except for some representations, bodies wrapped in shrouds are presented, or barefoot children looking for food, children devoid of name or story. They are just numbers, and even those numbers themselves are not shocking enough. Professor Gilligan's poignant statement, I'm quoting, speaking was one thing, being heard was another, encapsulates the heart of the matter. As Palestinians and as women, we must confront the harsh reality that our voices are frequently marginalized, our identities reduced to faceless enemies, stripped of names, stories, and the dignity of being counted. This dehumanization is perpetuated through demand for condemnation that implicitly question our humanity. Professor Gilligan's work inviting readers to consider the broader amplification of voice and agency amidst systematic marginalization. Professor Gilligan's book arrived at a crucial juncture amidst the profound despair, agony, and loss engulfing Israel-Palestine. Her insights compel us to consider the betrayal of the human voice and the essence of humanity itself. Her earlier work, In a Different Voice, was a disruptive force in psychology and morality by insisting on the inclusion of women's voices. Similarly, this book challenged us to listen to the often muted voices of the marginalized. Professor Gilligan elucidates the danger of silencing voices that protest and resist, warning of the risk of internalizing the oppressor's perspective. She emphasizes that concerns about justice and care are fundamentally human concerns. When individuals are taught to suppress their authentic voices, they become ensnared in doubt, stifling their willingness to confront conflict and speak out. This suppression creates a trauma that disconnects us from our own emotions and thoughts, a phenomenon starkly evident in the Israeli public denial of the atrocities occurring in Gaza and the erasure of Palestinian identity. As Palestinians, we resist not only the patriarchal voices and a militaristic order, but also the colonial structure of violence and elimination. Professor Gilligan call for radical listening urge us to attune ourselves to the underlying voices obscured by dominant narratives. In a world shaped by patriarchal norms, a woman's voice disrupt the status quo by exposing vulnerabilities and truth. Professor Gilligan's work urges us to focus on the political meaning of our experience. She reveals how individuals come to forget or seemingly not know what they inherently understand, leading to profound disconnection from their true selves and values. This phenomenon is particularly pertained in Israel, where political disassociation and moral denial are ingrained in the educational system, fostering a generation detached from the reality of ongoing injustices. In a Human Voice transcends the confines of gender discourse to delve into the essence of humanity itself. Gilligan research beckons us to challenge prevailing narratives, amplify marginalized voices, and disrupt hegemonic structure. It is a compelling call to action, urging us to listen, speak, and resist in pursuit of justice and dignity for all. Amidst the ongoing conflict, the Palestinian experience is characterized by complexity and contradiction. As Palestinian and Israeli citizens, our identities are intertwined with the history of displacement, resilience, and ongoing struggle. We navigate the delicate balance of holding Israeli citizenship while embracing our Palestinian history, a reality that challenged conventional notion of identity and belonging. The recent war in Gaza and the catastrophe of October 7th served as a stubborn reminder of the fragility of the human values. The dichotomy of good versus evil perpetuates a cycle of violence and dehumanization, rendering nuanced discourse all but impossible. As Israeli Palestinians, we grapple with this complexity of our dual identity, mourning the loss of life on both sides of the conflict while advocating for just and equitable resolution. In confronting the legacy of colonialism, we are faced with the daunting task of imagining a future beyond violence and oppression. Can we envision a model of decolonization that transcends mere violence, embracing dialogue and reconciliation as pathways to liberation? Frantz Fanon argues that decolonization will always be associated with violence. I'm quoting, "Decolonization is simply the replacement of one type of people with another." Fanon offers us an absolute model of decolonization in which the native completely removes the settler. This perception romanticizes the violence that has the power to change world orders and create new human. Fanon's vision is an apocalyptic vision of absolute victory on the path to liberation. The Fanonian option exacts a heavy price from both the native and the settler. The violence they engage in deprive them of their humanity and turns them into death machines in the process of liberation or into a genocidal machine. In the face of despair, we cling to hope, not as a radical notion, but as a steadfast belief in the possibility of a better future. Our voices may be silenced, our identity may be erased, but our humanity must endorse. It is through dialogue, empathy, and collective action that we will chart a course toward peace and justice for all. In conclusion, In a Human Voice serves as a timely reminder of the power of the storytelling to illuminate the complexities of the human experience. Through Professor Gilligan's lens, we are called to listen, to emphasize, and to act. Together, Palestinians and Israelis, we can create a world where every voice is heard and every life is valued. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rawia. Carol, do you want to respond?
Yeah, well, first of all, Rawia, it's so a deep pleasure to see you again. And thank you, because what you bring home, and I'm so grateful to you for doing this, is when I said that In a Different Voice is a disruption. I mean, it was intended from the beginning. I echo Francis here, as a disruption. But the question is, what was it intended to disrupt? And you put your finger on it. It was intended to disrupt, what would you call, a world, a culture, an intellectual framework, a politics that basically normalizes and justifies violence. I mean, just, it was that assumed that somehow the use of force or violence was a justified or normal response to how to deal with human conflict. And the second thing is it was a structure that was legitimized, that was taught, that was seen as acceptable, that rationalized not listening by saying, in effect, that certain people had voices that were worth listening to, and other people's voices should not be listened to or taken seriously because basically they weren't, quote, human beings, or they weren't fully human. And I really thank you, because that was the deepest intention of this work. And, you know, to say that in a different voice, that psychologists and moral philosophers and theorists had not listened to women. This is like half the population, Palestinian, Israeli, American, half the population were seen as having nothing worth listening to. That you could talk about morality or the self or this development without listening to the experience. And I began, and I appreciate your bringing this to the fore, by recalling my experience of listening to Professor Anita Hill when she was testifying in the hearings about the nomination of Clarence Thomas to be a Supreme Court justice. And remembering, because it was so vivid, I mean, I tell the story, at that time, the house across the street from mine was being painted. And the painters brought their radio to work with them every day. And they put it alongside them on the scaffold, which was outside the house because they were painting the house. And I remember Anita Hill's voice. I mean, she was, you know, very clear in this beautifully strong, clear voice. They had their radio turned out loud, and you could hear her voice. It went down the street like a river. And then I remember hearing it filtered through the responses of the senators who were holding the hearings. And I just remember the experience of hearing her and then hearing her not being heard. And it wasn't that she spoke very clearly. She had a voice. And part of my inner human voice is we all have a voice. I mean, as human beings, we are born with a voice, and the costs. My book is really about confronting the costs, and it's right in front of us, as you said, here right now, in Gaza, in Israel, and so forth, the costs of not listening, the costs of dealing with human conflicts with violence. And when I contrast patriarchy with democracy, and the contrast is between, in patriarchy, I mean, literally, a group of men who are considered the fathers, they have a voice that is supposed to be listened to, and the voices of their voice is over the voices of other men. Francis was talking about this, and also all women and children. And so democracy, everyone has a voice. And so everyone having a voice is the condition for addressing conflicts through relationships, not through the use of force. So the difference to me between patriarchy and democracy is the contrast between violence and voice in terms of how you resolve human conflicts. And, you know, it's just horrifying to see the assumption that the only way is through violence, and then we see it playing out. And the other thing that happens is, I think that what you get is how it silences those who would challenge it or criticize and so forth. So I'm very, very grateful. And for you to bring it into the present and to what's going on right now. I think both the present conflict, what's also going on in the US right now politically, the Dobbs decision, which reverses Roe v. Wade, which also, Ruthy, speaks to your points about, I mean, one of the effects of the Dobbs decision in the US is that when a woman becomes pregnant, she in effect has no voice. In many, many states now in the United States, a wall of silence is created around her. She cannot have any voice. So thank you so much, Rawia, for
thank you
for what you said. I really, and it's just, I'm so happy to see you again.
Me too. We were supposed to see each other in February, so here
yeah,
we go.
I know.
We have a little time left for questions from the audience. If you would like to sign up on the chat or use the reactions button to raise your hand. Any questions? If not, I have many more questions for Carol.
We can all talk among ourselves. This is such an honor to be with this group.
It's such a pleasure. Carol, we talked on our conversations in preparing for this event, and also you write in the book in a Human Voice how frustrated you felt that in a different voice was sort of softened. The message was de-radicalized, and it was read as a book on women's voice, and the whole issue of the radical aspects of the discussion on abortion were completely disregarded.
Right.
And then 40 years, fast forward 40 years later, we're back in the point that is actually before in a different voice. We're in 1972 all over again. Do you have any fears that in a Human Voice will also be de-radicalized and be viewed?
I mean, I think I wrote the book specifically because it was really, it was so frustrating to me. Because, for example, I say on page 2 of In a Different Voice, the different voice I describe is characterized not by gender, but by theme. And the fact that its association with women was an empirical observation. You know, if women do, which women do, the majority of the care work across societies, women and often women of color, then, you know, women are going to know something about what it means to care. I mean, and it means to pay attention. It means to listen. It means to have a voice. You cannot care if you're not present. I mean, all of these things which seem in some ways so obvious to us. So in a sense, the idea of making the book about women, but the irony to me, and you know, I'm a writer basically, so I'm sure the frustration is like, didn't I say this clearly on page 2? I mean, you know, it's like, but then you sort of have to think politically, why is this so challenging? Why is this so disruptive? And I think it's because it disrupts a patriarchal structure. I mean, a patriarchal structure, which is a structure of domination, where it elevates some men over other men and all men over women. It depends on those people who are on the top, the men and their consorts, often women who join them. Their empathy cannot be for the people on the bottom, or they cannot maintain this structure. I mean, you can't, you know, you can't bomb people if you have empathy for people. And the people on the bottom cannot have a voice that is taken seriously and listened to. So that's how the structure is maintained. And In a Different Voice was to challenge that structure. But in a sense, more to the point, my example of the ethic of care was started by listening to women who were making decisions about continuing or ending a pregnancy. And one of the things that struck me was the tendency for women to describe whatever a woman wanted to do. If she wanted to have the baby, that was selfish. If she wanted to have the abortion, that was selfish. Whereas it was good to do what other people wanted her to do or thought she should do. So basically, the good woman was to have no voice of her own, but to respond to other people. And I remember saying to women at the time, if it's good to be empathic with people and responsive to their needs and concerns, you're a person. Why is it selfish to respond to yourself? And woman after woman at that point said to me, good question. And that's the joining with the human rights thing. I mean, that yes, everybody should be listened to. So I wrote in a human voice to make it clear. I mean, I wasn't writing about the angel in the house who, always cares for everybody and is, as Virginia Woolf says, utterly unselfish. I was writing about women who claimed having a voice, who claimed moral agency, and were willing to make a decision where you had to, where it was not possible to act without causing hurt, and who questioned that if someone had to be hurt, it should be the woman. I mean, so it was women radically questioning both a moral philosophy that said, if I do anything for myself, it's at your expense. And if I do anything for you, it's at my expense. This zero-sum game, and said, this is not true. Our lives are interdependent. We are connected. And I was also challenging this notion, so I was challenging moral philosophy. I was challenging, and I felt, why was my voice heard as idealizing women? I mean, that was, and what the way you could do that was to ignore the abortion study. So I Googled, and this was surprising to me, in a different voice, an abortion decision study, which is the subject of chapters 2 and 3, concepts of self and morality and images of relationship, crisis and transition. It's all the material, the 2 central chapters of the book. If I Google in a different voice an abortion decision study, basically the only name that comes up is mine. It's sort of seen as, and then I'm accused of repeating kind of the idealistic images of the good woman, as women are like angels. We have no needs, we have no voice, all we do is serve other people. You can't even serve other people if you're not present. I mean, I interviewed women at a moment in history where, in a sense, a voice that was undercover was invited into the public, in part by the Supreme Court. I think it's very important to emphasize how the political structure at that moment created an opening for some women, obviously not all women, but some women, to say what they really thought. And it was a huge disruption. And I tell the story in my new book, and I'm curious about, because it comes out of an experience of when I was invited to the Knesset. I think this was 2017. And I talked, and it was by the women members. There are fewer now than there were then that were members of the center and the left. I mean, that's really interesting. How come there are fewer women now in the Knesset? And a woman said to me, do you know Ezer Kenegdo? And I didn't know Ezer Kenegdo. And I went back and I saw in Bereshit, in Genesis, in the second creation story, is this notion that, God creates the earthling Adam and then says what Adam needs is an Ezer Kenegdo, someone who will help by pulling him in a different direction. Saying, this is sort of in part ties in with your work, Ruthy, that men will be in some sense very vulnerable to being called into a kind of order of domination, and he will rule over her, and hiding and shaming and blaming, and need someone to pull him in a different direction. And so God created woman. And I was astounded that I had never heard of this. I mean, you think as a feminist, somebody might have told me about this. But no, nobody had. And then I noticed it's not translated. I mean, so I thought this notion of a disruption or something, maybe this ties directly because it's my view of the current situation, something that is so destructive that needs to be disrupted, that to find another way to deal with this conflict. And my work from the beginning, from In a Different Voice, was intended as a disruption. So it was confusing to me. It was puzzling to me. Did I not say it clearly? And I could see how I played into a culture that was, with the gender binary, was both idealizing and devaluing this very central aspect of human existence. And we now know, and certainly all the work on trauma emphasizes and underscores this, the price of carelessness. I mean, the cost of being careless with human beings, period. Just the cost of indifference and carelessness. It leaves a legacy that undermines people's capacity. It undermines people's humanity. So I think someone had a question.
Maybe I could say here,
Sure.
that listening to Carol and listening to Ruthy and listening to Rawia, we're living in a stage where the culture of a violent government, even amongst democratic countries, of authoritarian, violent government, women's voices emerge with men. We listen to some atrocious women's voices, which are indistinguishable from the patriarchal, hierarchical, authoritarian, tyrannical leadership which our societies have produced or allowed. And I think that also requires disruption. And I think Rawia brought it up very strongly in terms of the fact that in these systems, in these strong man systems, because when you look around the world at these political regimes and these religious authoritarian regimes, they are led by strong men, and they co-opt women's voices too. And so it's a different kind of intersectionality. It's a political intersectionality, which endangers the care ethic even more strongly, the democratic ethic, the care ethic, in all its manifestations. So I do want to say, because we do listen to a lot of atrocious women's voices at the moment, joining the men's, these tyrannical male voices.
And as we talked about before, I write in my book, in the 2020 election in the United States, 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump. So really, if you take a care ethic as a human ethic, you have to say, what happened to these men and what happened to these women, that they become a voice for not listening, for violence and so forth. Because I think it's extremely important. Now, one of the things that my research, because I'm a psychologist and I study development, so the importance of that 10 years I spent listening to girls was I saw how it came to pass, how it happens that a human being, a human voice goes undercover. So then people can speak. You don't hear it unless you question the cover voice. And that's not just true of women, it was true of both men and women. And I think so it's not surprising to me, because there are huge incentives that are held out. And my current project, which is with girls now, again, is called Breaking the Bargain. It's about the bargain that women make with patriarchy, that in exchange for being loved or included or promoted or having some high position or something, I will not say what I really think and feel. I will not say what I know firsthand on the basis of my experience. I will give up my voice And we saw that with the college presidents in the United States who testified before Congress. They had with the top of the educational, establishment, and they were asked a question, and it was as if they had no voice. And so you can say that what women give up, and also if you see a man acting in a tyrannical, authoritarian fashion, as if he has no capacity for empathy, as if he has no ability to feel the feelings of other people, or you have to say, what happened to this human being? That's a very different question. That is the importance of, I would say, joining in a different voice within a human voice, because it changes the questions you would ask.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up. I think we all could have stayed here and discussed this all day long, all night long here in Israel. But we have to finish. I would like to thank Carol Gilligan, our wonderful speakers, Francis Raday, Ruthy, Lowenstein, Lazar, Rawia, Aburabia, and again, the Faculty of Law and Professor Orna Ben-Naftali of the Emile Zola Chair for Human Rights for their generous support, which enabled the forthcoming Hebrew translation of In a Human Voice and this very meeting. So thank you all for joining us, and good night, and shalom, peace.
Shalom.
Shalom.
Thank you.
In every
Thank
meaning
you.
of the word.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much.